Welcome to the Last American Vagabond. Joining me today is Robert Inlakesh to talk about the current status of the post-October 7th ongoing war or genocide, however you want to discuss this, and give us some updates about what's going on from his perspective. He's very immersed in this, very personally connected to what's going on. And, you know, we're covering this pretty as much as we can day to day. But it's important to get his perspectives on this and add some, you know, I mean, I consider him to be an expert in a lot of the topics that we're discussing here. So it's important to see what he thinks about this and, you know, kind of break down the other aspects as well, the potential false flags, the budding kind of civil war conversation, what's going on with Iran and Lebanon. So Robert, thanks for joining me today, brother. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, man. I think you definitely have a good insight on a lot of this stuff that, you know, it's a different kind of objective perspective than you're going to get in the partisan conversation today. So let's start with the kind of general update about where we are. I mean, you know, you're a writer for TLAV. You're covering stuff pretty consistently on the website, but we haven't connected face to face for a while. So, you know, obviously there's a whole conversation about what's been going on since October 7th. Both our audiences are very aware this did not just begin on October 7th. So the conversation is sort of, you know, post that point forward. Where are we currently at with, you know, the death toll? What's the dynamic of the constant ceasefire deals and moving people around? And, you know, just generally take it wherever you like. You know, what's the current status in your mind and where we're at with all this?
Well, there's a number of things that we could hit on there. I suppose where we're at now is we're entering potentially another phase of this war where it's going to perhaps more heavily be focused on Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, than it has previously because of these insane assassinations that have been carried out. The first major provocation being the assassination of Fouad Shukr, who was a top military commander in Hezbollah in Beirut. And that inflicted a civilian massacre in the southern suburbs of Beirut. It killed 3 children and 2 women in the process and injured around 80 people, some of them with serious injuries, and they're still recovering in hospital. And then hours later, there was an assassination, which everyone knows about by now, of Ismail Haniyeh, who is or was the head of the Hamas movement. He's now been replaced with someone who was the Gaza leader for Hamas named Yahya Sinwar. And he was assassinated in Tehran. There's a number of different claims about how exactly he was killed, in terms of whether it was a drone or missile fired from nearby, etc. But we do know that he was killed in the Iranian capital. And now Iran has gone to the United Nations and said that under Article 51 of the UN Charter, they will respond. There's a harsh response that they say that they are going to carry out against the Israelis. Hezbollah also has their response. And then also Ansarullah in Yemen also has a response that they have to carry out because the port of Hodeidah was struck, which killed, I believe, 3 civilians and injured something around 80 others.
Was that a U.S. strike or an Israeli strike?
Israeli strike. They struck in response to Ansarullah sent a drone into Tel Aviv, and that killed an Israeli who was a member of the Israeli military, but was, of course, you know, in a civilian capacity. He was sleeping in his apartment, so he was not active at that time. And the Israelis responded by striking Hodeidah, the port, and hit oil refineries. So they struck a number of targets, and you know, the site was burning for over a day. So there's now these 3 responses which have to come. We're waiting for them. We've heard from Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, that the response will come and that it won't be simply symbolic. It will be a tough response. And then, of course, we have Iran and Yemen, and a lot of people are speculating on how that will look. My estimation is that if the response is strong enough, the Israelis obviously will have to mount some sort of retaliation. And depending upon what the Israelis do from there, we may have a full-scale regional war, whether that's with Lebanon or involving Iran. But definitely we've entered a new phase now. And after the response, then we will see that phase continue. In my opinion, the only way that this war is going to come to a conclusion is if there is an immediate ceasefire very quickly for the response, and maybe a little bit of tit for tat, or the responses. Or if Israel is not willing, this will have to escalate into a full-scale regional war, and a ceasefire will have to come afterwards, and it will have to be a comprehensive ceasefire. It does not look like Israel has any interest in simply ending the fighting in Gaza. It looks like its ambitions, according to Benjamin Netanyahu's address to Congress, was that he seeks to have Israeli soldiers occupy Gaza internally for the foreseeable future, at the very least. He says we don't want to occupy it, forever. But I mean, when they have their troops there, how are they going to remove them? Who is going to work with them? There's no way that they can place settlements there, for instance. It's just not viable. It's not even safe for their troops. So we're entering an escalatory phase. If there's no ceasefire, I don't think there's going to be a ceasefire right now. I think that will have to come after an escalation of some kind. And so we're at a very dangerous point, because the Israelis economically are burdened. Their army has been weighed down. Their troops are very tired, exhausted, not well trained enough to enter another conflict after Gaza. They have suffered enormous losses in Gaza, much of which they've covered up. And the Israelis are on the brink of collapse, basically. And that collapse may not come immediately. I'm not saying that, within a few weeks or months that Israel won't exist anymore. But certainly it's now put itself on the trajectory of national suicide. And that's what we have at the moment. And their society reflects it. They're going utterly insane. And I'm not using hyperbole here. They're clinically insane, that society is. I mean, you look at the recent development with the arrest. Initially, they accused 10 Israeli reserve soldiers at the Satiman detention center, which is inside of a military facility, where the soldiers are the ones who are the guards. It's not part of the Israeli prison complex. So they hold all these Palestinians there without charge. And then they discovered, 10 of them participated in the gang rape of a Palestinian with some sort of metal stick, I believe. Initially, everyone thought, because these reports were coming out for so long, and CNN it started with, New York Times came out, the United Nations released information. Now we have B'Tselem, Israel's top human rights organization, which, a few days ago published their report. And so now we have all of this mounting evidence. A lot of people thought, maybe the United States and the UK had pressured the Israelis into doing something about this horrendous torture, sexual humiliation, and rape that was going on in the Satiman detention center against Palestinians held without any charges whatsoever. They claim that they're Hamas and Nukba terrorists and all of this nonsense. But there's no way that is true, because they're literally holding them without any charge, and they would be transferred into an actual prison facility if there was any evidence that they had on them. So after the Israeli soldiers did this, and this is why I'm bringing this up, there were protesters that stormed the military bases and attempted to free, bringing with them militia forces, far-right militia forces, and Israeli lawmakers to try and release these soldiers accused of gang rape against a Palestinian who later died as well of his wounds. And then it got even worse. There was a debate in the Knesset about it. So Israeli lawmakers were debating whether it's okay to rape a Palestinian prisoner if you accuse him of being Hamas. And, there was a member of Benjamin Netanyahu's ruling Likud party, the most popular party for the longest period of time, for decades, basically in Israel, which was advocating, yes, you have the right to, do whatever you want. You can gang rape a Palestinian, that's fine, if you accuse him of being Hamas. And then it got even worse, even more severe. We then learned there was a video of the incident, and that's likely why they were actually arrested. Now, there's only 8 which are still in detention, One of them was let go early. The other one was arrested, but then they let him go. They brought that guy on Israeli television to basically brag about what he did and talk about how he was so moral and wonderful and the soldiers are doing a great job. And he was receiving support. The Israeli media, many channels, they supported this action and they were in support of what the soldiers did in Satim detention center, even after the video came out. And then they put a poll out, Channel 12 News in Israel, put a poll out. 47% of the Israeli public that responded to the poll, 47% said it's permissible to rape a Palestinian prisoner. And 43% said no, 10% said they have no idea. So that's where the Israeli society is at. And that's because, 40,000+ businesses have gone bust. The Israeli port of Eilat has declared bankruptcy. Their army is tired. They've lost thousands of tanks and military vehicles, which even if they're just, for instance, damaged, it takes a very long time to get the parts and to repair these vehicles. They are extremely burdened. They're in a dire state when it comes to their domestic tension that is ongoing between this sort of religious right and then secular right, which are competing with each other. And they've also been embarrassed in the security sense. So in every marker, the Israelis are being slowly defeated in what you could almost call a war of attrition. And they're freaking out, and their society is becoming even more radical and, quite frankly, sick. And that's what we see happening at the current moment.
And we've seen examples now of the very same extreme settlers who have been given official status to act this way against Palestinians, now turning around and focusing on the very Israeli government in because of this divide, and kind of the monster they created, essentially, turning around. And it just shows, as you're highlighting, the kind of degradation of this society, and it's really sad to see that. And we should point out that there are, and I agree with you entirely, and this is not even up for debate, it's verifiable in a lot of different ways, that the vast majority, unfortunately, or at least in many ways, is in line with what the Israeli government is doing. There are people that are speaking out, including on the corporate media in Israel, who are saying this is wrong, just to make sure people hear that. There are some that push back, but you're right, it's an alarming amount of people that are acting like not only this is okay, but glorifying it, acting like this it's not just acceptable, but it's a necessity. Like, this is really a dark time for them. And I think it's good that people are starting to see all this. So I wanted to ask you, and so that we'll talk about that a bit more, about the camp and the prison location in general. But you went on, you talked about Iran. I wanted to ask you in general, do you think that the response from Iran is and this is just your opinion, obviously, based on what's happened in the past, do you expect this to be a measured kind of, the typical thing we've seen in the past to kind of guarantee no larger escalation, like hitting a location in Iraq, for example, that they know the Israelis are using, where they can act like, well, we weren't necessarily, that kind of a thing where it's slightly removed? Or do you think this might very well be the attack that is, as they're kind of floating, that this will be a more serious response? And then if that does happen, what do you expect will be the fallout from the U.S. and Israel?
I expect it to be a direct strike on Israeli targets. I don't.
In regard to Israel proper, or just targets somewhere in the world?
Inside Israel proper, what's called Israel proper. I believe it.
Occupied Palestine.
I definitely think after what happened in April with Operation True Promise, which was essentially Iran throwing a lot of older weapons and then a few of its newer missiles, ballistic missiles at the Israelis, and demonstrating that it can hit sensitive targets. After that, that was the warning. So now they're in a position where they have to do something. They have to hit serious targets. What those targets will be is anyone's guess. This time around, the thing that makes me confident that this will be some sort of significant strike, I don't know what exactly they're going to hit. If I, just based upon what I know, if I was an Iranian decision maker in the IRGC, I would probably take out the Israeli airfields. That would probably be strategically the smartest thing to do. Israel has demonstrated that it's willing to take risks. and it's willing to act in a completely irrational way and violate all international norms. So there is a chance that no matter what you do, the Israelis are going to mount a considerable response this time. They didn't last time around. It was sort of a cop-out. But it does seem like they might do something this time around, because if you hit something serious, they're going to be forced to respond in some way or another. If I was in their position, I would probably be looking at Israeli airfields to take them out, to make sure that if Israel wants to launch, a large-scale campaign against Iran and Lebanon and Yemen, etc., that they wouldn't have the ability to launch such an attack or sustain such an attack for a long period of time. And without those airstrips, they wouldn't be able to use their fighter jets, or at least very effectively. And so that's what I would say might be strategically viable here, but I have no way of knowing. Last time around, in April, I actually heard from sources about the 72-hour warning, which was issued by the Iranians. I didn't actually think that was, I thought somebody was perhaps making something up at the time, but it was true. The Iranians did issue a warning. I was told that a warning had been issued, and that the response was going to come within the next 72 hours. And it did. It came exactly as was described. A lot of people speculated as well, were saying what might happen. And
as you described at the time, that was all part of sort of the engine, the logic behind doing that, right? It was making a demonstration, right?
It was a demonstration. It wasn't a direct, like a strike which was intended to kill anyone. It wasn't intended to take out any real strategic targets. The intention of that mission was to create a bit of a fireworks show, get the Israelis and their allies to spend an enormous amount of money to combat old technology, and also demonstrate that Iran can hit the most sensitive and guarded sites that the Israelis have. That was the intention, and they did it. And the Israelis didn't mount much of a response. And of course, they claimed this massive victory and air defenses and stuff like this. And they played, the media played along with that. So they demonstrated their power, but now they need to actually do something, because this time around, Israel has crossed the red line. So this time around, I'm not hearing anything. I'm not hearing speculation and talk and what the Iranians might do. It's all just from any sources that I have. They're just speculating themselves. They're just talking, well, they might do this, and they'd be smart to do this. And but
I've heard a lot of claims over the last week of they're going to attack in 24 hours. And we know our sources say, like, every day the last couple of, maybe that's just to kind of taunt or worry the people in the government of Israel. But it's usually you get those. So you haven't heard any of that so far.
No, I haven't heard any of that. And so that's the thing, when I've seen these reports come out in the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and they're speculating, and our sources say this, and, quoting these unnamed security officials, and even the story about how Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated, trying to claim they planted an explosive there like a few months back. These claims are just ridiculous and made up, in my opinion. I think they pulled them out of thin air. Maybe the intelligence community's feeding this to the journalists, and the journalists just accept it and print it, and don't think about it critically, right? And fair enough, if you have an intelligence source and a few of them are saying the same thing, then you have grounds to report it. But obviously, this seems to be something which is, it has an element of psychological warfare to it.
Right.
And so no, all of these claims, nobody knows. Nobody has any clue what they're going to do in reality. So anyone telling you that they know what Iran's going to do, they're lying, or they're being fed disinformation, in my opinion, because by now we would have heard something. If you have enough sources in that region, you hear things, and nobody knows. Nobody actually knows. So this time I take it very seriously that the response will be significant. I don't think Iran is going to launch, and this is my opinion completely, I don't think Iran is going to launch a whole bunch of ballistic missiles into Tel Aviv and Haifa and kill thousands of people. I don't think that is plausible. I don't even know if they'll bother trying to hit Tel Aviv or Haifa, to be honest. I don't if that's going to happen, it's more likely from Ansar Allah or Hezbollah. But a lot of people are speculating about this, and they're opening up the bomb shelters and talking about how Iran is insane. I think that Iran, whatever they do, will be strategic. It's going to be well thought through. The fact that they've left it this long means that there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and including looking at how perhaps this could influence bringing about a ceasefire as well, afterwards. Because you always want to leave space for that and achieving the long-term objective. If it's impossible to achieve that objective, however, Iran has to be prepared to enter into a battle with Israel. Not a full-scale war. A full-scale war would involve likely nuclear weapons. Iran would level Israel. It would be all over. Israel would be completely destroyed. Perhaps millions of people would be killed in Iran. It would be horrifying. And so I don't think that that is going to happen. It always could. There's always the possibility that something like that, it could evolve into that. I think there's going to be a battle and a trade of blows that will likely come out of this. How that's going to happen, how it's going to evolve, I couldn't tell you. I could just try and analyze it to the best of my ability.
My worry is that, in a measured scenario where even on a similar footing, which is not the reality, you might see that. But it seems to me that Israel, like you just described, is very aware that they're in the detriment here, or rather, not the right word. They're in a position of weakness, right? And I thought this is what worries me, that you will see just to make this point right now, this is what, and again, this is kind of coming from the people arguing this is what they're hearing from their sources and so on. But one of the arguments here was that and this was stated by Israel themselves, saying that if they attack the locations that they're hearing, they're going to, like Tel Aviv and so on, and we can make a point about the whole human shield dynamic, that they will be responding disproportionately, which is kind of a ridiculous thing to say. Like, so we're going to commit a war crime if you attack us, kind of a statement, the whole proportionality is a very important part of that. But what's interesting is it's sort of like, my point is, I feel like that is not a false claim, that they will lash out in the idea being, the Samson option type of conversation. I really do worry about where that goes. And I want to actually ask you about that in general. But first, this point about bombing this location, you mentioned the point about them kind of rushing into their underground areas and so on. What are your thoughts on this point about both, using their locations as human shields, as it were? Like, this one's about the Lebanon areas embedding themselves in human areas, but I'm sure you've seen this conversation, right? Does the presence of the IDF's headquarters in Tel Aviv endanger the city's population? And you've got these, images from that article itself that are showing you that, this is where we're talking about, and they have that location right in the center of the area. You don't think that might be a location potentially that Iran might bomb? I mean, do you think they consider the civilian population and so on?
It's hilarious when you look at this, because, of course, everything they accuse others of doing, they do themselves. And the thing is, I wouldn't necessarily fault them for putting an intelligence building in the middle of Tel Aviv, for instance. I mean, most major powers, have targets in their capital cities and major cities, which could be hit in the event of military conflict, for instance, right? I'd say that where they do definitely use their own civilians, or at least civilian infrastructure as shields for them, is definitely in the north. We've seen that time and time again. Hezbollah is hitting civilian buildings which have been evacuated and are being used by soldiers. So when these buildings are struck, they're civilian buildings that they're hitting. So like that's the thing. And not only that, the Israelis, there's countless cases of them using Palestinians as human shields. We spoke before last time about the implementation of the neighbor procedure. The Israelis this time around, they don't care anymore. They're just using human shields left, right, and center of Palestinian civilians. And there's not a single case of Hamas doing this. The argument that they try and make, because they can't make the argument that Hamas is actually using human shields, like the technical, like if you're going to go to the definition of actually using somebody as a human shield, forcing them to, in front of like a place where it's going to, they're essentially going to be hit before you, or trying to use them to stop an enemy from attacking you. So they go to, Hamas fires rockets from areas which are like, densely populated urban areas, right? And that's not human shielding.
Right.
You could say that that's reckless. You could argue that that's many things, that they're fighting from within densely populated areas. So that's just urban warfare. The Israelis are doing that.
Right.
Everyone does that when they're fighting in such environments, and they don't have any other options. So you could make an argument that, okay, because they're firing rockets from inside areas where there are civilians nearby, that somehow is, a violation of international law. That's the argument the Israelis make. But in that case, it's like, well, the Israelis possess precision weapons. So why wouldn't they just strike those military sites? Why would they have it? If you can kill a person inside their bedroom with a single munition and not have to murder all those other people in those other rooms, why are you using a 2,000-pound bomb, a 1,000-pound bomb, or multiple 500-pound bombs to attack a civilian densely populated area or a tower block which is populated?
Right.
So,
and I would add to that as well that there's little, if not zero, evidence that shows that anyway. Like the examples of them firing from within civilian areas. I mean, that's not to say it didn't happen, because I'm with you. I mean, that's almost common in this type of warfare. But what's interesting is, despite that claim, and even that being clearly not the same as human shields, everything they continue to put up ends up being shown to be false. Like there's one that was very famously debunked. I think it was even by BBC, where they said, "Oh, here's the example, the glowing example of what we keep saying," and it turned out it was the wrong location. They showed they were technically not even on the property they claimed they were. It happens every time. So it's ridiculous that even that claim is not backed by evidence, but it continues to be floated. But yeah, the human shield dynamic part of this is just one of the most ridiculous of all of it. But to bring it back to the point in regard to so one side of this, we see the obvious war on the Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank and anywhere else. But then what you were highlighting is that this is kind of boiling over into this larger regional war, which, as you've highlighted in its statements openly by people like Gavir and Smotrich, that's what they want. Right. So that's the one aspect of this is you're saying you see this kind of boiling over into this larger war that I think is a very problematic aspect. But taking it back to the focal point of the Palestinians themselves, where are we at with that situation? Like, just as your most current information, because one that I think a lot of people have seen is we have the obvious Lancet report, right, showing the estimation of 186,000 potential deaths so far. You have the conversation of the disease deliberately being used that you've highlighted. You wrote an article about that, and just the ongoing displacement. Like I just saw Khan Yunis for the example being displaced yet again. So what's your mindset? What's the update of what's going on with them right now? Like, let's put it this way, we've seen them driven into a corner in Rafah and Khan Yunis and so on. So what's the logical next step? What's currently happening in that regard?
Well, the Israelis are, like you said, consistently displacing the civilian population. There is an area which they've expanded. It was originally in Mawasi. They call this their safe zone area. They expanded that into surrounding areas and made it a larger so-called safe zone area. But then what they do is they change which zones are actually the safe zone. So people have to consistently move out of different areas. And obviously that's psychological warfare. It means that people have to end up sleeping on streets. You're seeing the video now of people, the mass exodus of people. And this is happening all over Gaza, wherever the Israeli military chooses to do a short incursion. They might do an incursion for 6-7 days and then leave, might be there for a few weeks. They might be there for 1 or 2 days, or they might just threaten to attack somewhere and the people have to leave. And of course, also you got the fact that these people are packed together in very densely populated areas, separated only by tents and crude structures, which they're sheltering in, where they have little access to enough food. They don't have the right products for hygiene. Many of them in different areas, people are completely deprived of food and are starving to death. And we see deaths from starvation, especially amongst children. And those with pre-existing health conditions every day, essentially now. But also we have the fact that the water supply was already 97% undrinkable before this war. But now, of course, the water is just completely polluted with sewage. And the World Health Organization and the Gaza Health Ministry together did tests on the water, and they found traces of polio in the water. It's at this point, I believe the figure is 1.4 million people had contracted some sort of disease, infectious disease. In the Gaza Strip, it may be 1.8. I may be getting that figure wrong. It would actually be in this article, somewhere in this article, that figure. And so the people in Gaza, like things like diarrhea, for instance, are rampant now. There are diseases that are coming back which have not existed there and have been, obliterated there and have not been in existence before, which are spreading amongst the population because, they're drinking contaminated water. They don't have clean water supply. Most of the water is not clean that they're drinking because they don't always get the aid in. So then there's all sorts of different issues which come of that, different poisonings. And, a lot of these things will present themselves later in chronic illnesses.
Right.
Then you have obviously the mental health aspect of it and the trauma inflicted, especially on children who have seen the most horrifying massacres and have witnessed 24/7 around the clock bombings and drones in the sky and living and seeing their relatives and friends die. And the death toll officially, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, does rest around 40,000 dead, right? 70% of whom are women, children, and the elderly, roughly. But then if you look, like you mentioned, the Lancet report that was published a few weeks back, I believe now, the figure that was presented as a more probable figure based upon conservative estimates. Like, this is not the maximum number. It's not they're floating a number which would be like the absolute highest to try and, I don't know, scare people or have like that fear factor. No, this is the conservative estimate that was calculated, and that's 186,000 out of a population in Gaza, which is about 2.2 million, roughly. Now it was around 2.3 million before. Around 100,000 people left Gaza. And now, if this figure is correct, which I have a feeling it most likely is, then the population has been reduced to 2 million. So we've lost roughly 300,000 people altogether, 100,000 left. They've been ethnically cleansed, essentially. They're not able to come back. And then you've got 200,000, just under 200,000, if this figure is correct, who have been killed directly or indirectly. And so if you know anyone in Gaza, if you have enough contacts there, if you have extended family there, everyone has lost somebody very close to them. Everyone. You speak to people there. I don't know anyone from Gaza that hasn't lost at least a dozen family members. At least.
My God.
I've told you, and I've said on this program before, that from my wife's family alone, there's over 120 people that we've lost. So, this gives, an idea of the scale of human suffering. I have friends who are journalists. They've lost their colleagues. They've lost their best friends. Their friends from childhood, just gone, blown up with their families. They've lost brothers and sisters, right? Mothers, fathers. I've got a journalist friend who's in the north now. His wife and his infant son were killed in an airstrike. So, everyone is losing. And you've just pulled this up just then, the journalists which have been killed.
Mm-hmm.
And many of these journalists were targeted, like Ismail El-Ghul, who was an Al Jazeera correspondent, who was hit with a precision missile strike on his car, and it also killed his colleague as well. And he was literally left decapitated.
Mm-hmm.
It's a horrifying video if you watch it. And this is right here. I don't know if they're exactly going to show you the initial image of him sitting there. It's just
I think it's blurred out. Yeah, this is a really hard video to watch, especially when she's kind of emotionally breaking down while she talks about doing everything they can to, follow their arbitrary rules that they don't listen to. And, it's hard to listen to To think about going, the hunt, was it 165 that we can prove that have now been targeted and killed? Many, as you said, direct assassinations, killing their families alongside with, it's just, I hate how normalized this has become, and it's just such a horrifying on the face reality that this is the epitome of evil. I mean, this is why when this started, we've gotten to a point like interesting overlap, like Michael Yeadon, who was a scientist who made this conclusion about the COVID-19 conversation, where it's very difficult for him to kind of make that step and just go, you know what, this is not just wrong or criminal. We're dealing with evil, that's, I mean, honestly, anybody like you that's been covering this as long as you have, you already know that, but for a lot of average people who are just now fully seeing this picture, just take a step back and recognize this is how Palestinians have been living for 75 years. That's under this evil occupation that are willing to make them suffer. Like, sorry about that. This really does just get under my skin. I can't, watching this stuff every day. It's the worst part about it. Like I've said on the first week, it's not just that it's happening, but that it's happening, and not even then that they're allowing it, but they're standing up and telling you that it's okay. Not even just okay, but it's righteous, and you should praise them for what they're doing. Like, this is going to put a scar on people's minds forever. It's just such a disgusting thing that's happening here. And, more than just journalists, and I want to make sure you guys don't miss that. Robert's amazing article on this discussing the deliberate nature of causing these things. And I don't know if you saw this in regard to disease, that is specifically, and even statements saying that, but they're now sending, I think, 1 million injections from the WHO specifically for polio. And my thought process is like, my God, problem, reaction, solution. And I also want to point out, realizing that this has to pass through the hands of Israel, the very group that is clearly trying to harm them, starving them to death, testing things on them. And now you're going to let the Israelis process what you're going to give them in regard to what they're going to, for the disease they cause. I mean, on that note, do you have any thoughts on that, Robert?
Well, the thing with that is, I mean, there's barely any food getting through to this population. Right. We're talking about anesthesia people don't have. I don't even think the Israelis would even permit the vaccines going through, to be honest with you. So that whole conversation about what Israel could do, for instance, I'll give you an example. During the whole COVID-19 era, the Israelis had vaccines which were ready to expire, which they wanted to send to the Palestinian Authority to inoculate the population of the West Bank. And so they actually dispatched them. But then people, it was revealed, there were journalists who covered it and looked at the expiration date. And then there's the question about how these vaccines are stored as well. And the Israelis right now, they are enacting a genocide against the Palestinians. We've actively seen that Israelis, high-ranking Israelis, have, including Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, have advocated spreading epidemics in Gaza to wipe out the population. So they cannot be trusted with anything to do with the health of the people of Gaza. And they tightly control the Gaza Strip of what goes in and what goes out. And I don't believe that you could even trust them to bring anything in. And if they did, they'd likely just smash everything just to rub it in a little bit more.
Honestly, though, my worry more, and you're right, though, like that's the first step, is if anybody out there thinks this is what they need or what's in their best interest, why would we believe that they would let that happen if their actions are so clearly to the opposite everywhere else? But as I think that's been demonstrated, this is not some conspiratorial perspective. This is the kind of thing Israel has been shown to be doing just since October 7th, but for a lot longer. Like, what else might happen there? Not to say that we have to answer that question, but you're giving them, think about this. You're in a position where these are people that they're actively trying to kill and suppress and starve, and then you're giving them an opportunity to use this situation where you're going to be giving them things they're going to willfully inject into their bodies. I just, that seems like a dark opportunity for somebody that would clearly take advantage. That's just my personal opinion. But, it worries me in every one of those angles, including what you said, that they would just, are taking action just to let them not get what they might need. And on top of that, the point you made to start is obviously important. So here they are rushing through some injections, but you can't give them food. It's painful how obvious this all is.
It's horrifying. And that's the thing when we hear that people are going to transfer anything into the Gaza Strip. I mean, I've always said, don't hold your breath. Nothing is going to get in proper quantities.
Right.
I mean, you are literally seeing fathers breaking down after working basically 24/7. Like they take shifts just to sleep. They just get up and work, get up and work. As doctors, after having to amputate the legs or arms of their own children or their brother or sister's children, their nephews and nieces. It's truly horrifying what is happening there on every single level. And you don't need to even see the Israeli human rights report from B'Tselem, for instance, the top human rights group, Israeli human rights group, about them manufacturing a famine. You don't need to read through the volumes and volumes and hundreds of pages of documentation by basically every single organ of the United Nations to be able to tell that Israel is committing large-scale war crimes. You don't even need, after all the evidence that we've seen now, to hear it from a human rights organization that Israel is raping en masse Palestinians in detention facilities like Satiman, because the evidence is already there. We even have videos of it.
Right.
So we see every day, it's just an update on the phone, 15 more children killed. That's literally every time I open my phone, and it's constant updates about this. There's another massacre. Here's a video from the massacre in a school today. Here's a massacre in this refugee camp today. They just targeted a journalist today. They just killed, a mother and her child who were walking to go get water today. Oh, more people have been, 100,000 people have been displaced from here, and the horrible videos of them just carrying whatever they have, going to another area, and people sleeping on the streets. That is what is happening every day. At this point, and I go through not every single one of these human rights reports. It's just not possible for me to read in that volume. There's just not enough time. There's so many. It's every other day there's a human rights report. Every single day there's more documentation. So I at least skim through it. I look and I check sources for different elements of those reports that I'm looking for specific details. And I review to the best of my ability all the reports that we see coming out. For instance, I haven't gotten to actually look at B'Tselem's report, which was released about torture of Palestinians in detention. I haven't got around to looking at that yet because there's just such a volume of this stuff. But you don't even need it at this point.
Right.
You can just open your phone and the evidence is there. It's all over the internet.
Since you mentioned the doctors, I think you've probably seen this, but I think this is one of the most powerful that I've seen. It's a Jewish doctor who is there helping treat these Palestinians who are being genocided. And this is his response. I believe it was with CNN, and it's emotional, but I think it's worth seeing since you brought it up.
In Gaza?
End of April for the first couple of weeks. And then there's sniper bullets. I have children that were shot twice.
Wait, you're saying that children in Gaza are being shot by snipers?
Definitively. I have 2 children that I have photographs of that were shot so perfectly in the chest I couldn't put my stethoscope over their heart more accurately, and directly on the side of the head in the same child. No toddler gets shot twice by mistake by the world's best sniper. And they're dead center shots.
In fact, more than 20 doctors recently in Gaza also told Sunday Morning about gunshot wounds to children. One American doctor told us he even reviewed CT scans to confirm what he saw because he, quote, didn't believe that this many children could be admitted to a single hospital with gunshot wounds to the head. Some shootings have been captured on video.
So, of all the disaster zones you've seen, how does Gaza compare?
All of the disasters I've seen combined, 40 mission trips, 30 years, ground zero, earthquakes, all of that combined doesn't equal the level of carnage that I saw against civilians in just my first week in Gaza.
And when you say civilians, is it mostly children?
Almost exclusively children. I've never seen that before. Never seen that. I've seen more incinerated children than I've ever seen in my entire life combined. I've seen more shredded children in just the first week.
Shredded?
Shredded.
What do you mean?
Missing body parts. being crushed by buildings, the greatest majority, or bomb explosions, the next greatest majority. We've taken shrapnel as big as my thumb out of 8-year-olds.
The UN reports that to date, more than 80% of Gaza's population has been displaced, and the majority of its buildings destroyed. A reality which has taken its own toll on the well-being of children.
What about the emotional wounds?
How can you measure that? I can't measure my own. How do you be an orphan and watching your family, melted in front of you and shredded in front of you? How do you fix that? Ever fix that?
In fact, so many Palestinian children have had family members killed that doctors created a shorthand term, WCNSF, wounded child, no surviving family.
I just don't know how it's possible that that kind of stuff can be out there, let alone from a Jewish doctor, and have this be completely disregarded by some people. I think it's the sign of the fact that we still have morals. But every time I see something like this, that one in particular, it gets me every time. I feel like I want to go break something every time I watch that. It's just it's unreal, So that point right there shows us that it's not just a known factor, as you're highlighting, the unbelievable amount of human rights reports, the United Nations, individuals, governments around the world now beginning one by one to fall in line with the reality that, this is genocide, but all seemingly kind of letting it continue. What do you think is the stopping point here? Like, what's the logic? Why do you think that it just continues to happen? And what do you think is going to be the moment at which this actually stops?
The moment it stops is when Israel is forced to stop. The United States has demonstrated it won't do that. The European powers have demonstrated they won't do that. So it's going to have to be done by armed force in the Middle East. That's how I see it. Israel has to be under an existential threat for this to end, in my opinion, because they see this as being existential. They see this as this conflict here is posing a threat to their existence. And the reason it does actually pose a threat to their very existence as a state is because of what they've done. They're isolated now. Nobody, even these governments in the West, you see it like your Matt Millers and whoever else, these spokespeople in the United States who stand there and lie for a living. Even for them, it's embarrassing. You can see it on their faces.
Right.
They don't know what to say. Okay, if they're lying about other conflicts that the United States is involved in, like whether it be Ukraine or it be, Venezuela or wherever else, they can lie and, they do it convincingly and they have some vigor behind it, they feel confident. You can see that. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to this conflict and having to defend Israeli lawmakers that are advocating sodomizing defenseless prisoners held without a charge, the massacres daily of children, all these horrifying events, the starvation of a civilian population, the mass displacement of a civilian population, the destruction of almost all the infrastructure there that matters in Gaza, to the point where there's so much rubble. The estimates are that it will take something between 10 and 15 years to clear the rubble. That's how much rubble they've created. The United States is not going to do anything about it, obviously. Mm-hmm. The United States has a shared goal, that the government of the United States, not the people, of course, but the government has a shared goal with the Israelis. They have sought from the beginning of this, and October 7 was a massive wedge in their agenda. It destroyed their agenda, and they haven't gotten over the fact that it did destroy their Middle East agenda, that they want to create this new Middle East corridor to Europe, the new Hejaz railway through the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and then through occupied Palestine to Europe. They want to make sure and ensure there's a normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and the Israelis in order to do this. And that's what Biden was talking about in September before October 7 happened at the G20 summit. He said, this is big, this is major news. That was their agenda. And the United States, when October 7 happened, they threw all their weight behind the Israelis. They said, do whatever you want. Let's escalate the tensions with Iran. Let's go and assassinate leaders all over the region. Let's launch a military campaign, Operation Prosperity Guardian, it's called, in the Red Sea, which has failed. And they've spent billions in taxpayer dollars on it to fail their mission at trying to break the blockade of Ansar Allah in the Red Sea, which is stopping Israeli shipping. And so they've followed the Israelis at every single turn. And that's because they don't have any alternative plan for the Middle East. Their plan was this Saudi normalization, this new trade route, to oppose through Biden's PGII, to oppose the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And that was the vision, but that was destroyed. And so now it's just, well, how much can we continue to escalate with Iran? How many Arab nations can we get behind this escalation? And they don't have an alternative.
As you pointed out in your article, I want to make sure we include it. You made a great point about this, that, they went ahead with this, acting like the Palestinians were a non-issue, right? We know we can deal with that, but then clearly that ended up being the one thing that it kind of put a stick in the spokes of the agenda, right? And now it's all kind of went the other direction. But so let me ask you something about this, because I find this to be an interesting point. Because I agree, just objectively, whether this was the intent and it went awry or whatever actually happened, it's clear that the what happened on October 7th, or maybe you could frame it as what they did after that, has destroyed everything that they were trying to build, right? But let me ask you this, because of what we now know of the foreknowledge, which there's plenty of ways you could argue that it was just their hubris that let that get ignored, but I don't believe that, or the amount of time, hours in which it seemed that there was nobody there, there's nobody stopping them as they were coming in, all these different things you and I have talked about already, the idea of the Hannibal Directive and all these different post actions, with that knowledge, what's your opinion now of whether there was actual allowance to this? Whether it be a part of their government, all of their government, an individual, like whatever it was, like sort of allowing this to happen, or at least hoping that it would, like, what do you think? And the first question is, do you think that is part of that, and to what degree? And then do you think that was under the mindset or I guess the better question is, do you see that as sort of the divide between like the religious extremists and the right part of the party, like allowing this as a kind of a drive towards the whole, prophetic end, as opposed to the other ones that didn't have I guess kind of a confusing way to ask it. Do you think that there was the foreknowledge involved with that? And then to what degree do you think the religious right might have played a part in that?
Well, it's a very valid point. Look, I've seen so many people argue this, and it's argued in good faith. And it's also like, it appears to actually have a lot of evidence behind it, mountains of evidence behind it. But it's how you interpret that evidence. Mm-hmm. And then it's how you put it all together. And then what is the most obvious conclusion, using Occam's razor, what actually happened, and what is most likely here. If you know about the Israeli security system, like for instance, somebody like myself, and I don't expect anyone else to know about these things, because unless you're actually reading their security reports and you're in tune with what they're saying and the warnings that they constantly get, and what's passed around in the intelligence circles that they run in, you won't necessarily know anything about this. So obviously, there's different claims, and I'd have to go through each one of them in order to address them all. However, my conclusion is this was not allowed to happen. This was a mistake. And the reason why I say it's a mistake is we say there's a lot of talk about Egypt warned them. The United States said there was a warning. These warnings come all the time. There is not just for October 7. The warnings are constantly coming in. Not only did the Israelis themselves receive intelligence warnings, right? That there were training exercises, there's been training exercises happening for a major event since 2021, and actually before 2021.
Interesting.
And if you listen to the speeches of Yahya Sinwar, who is now the leader of Hamas, he's now been placed in as the leader of the entire movement, but the leader of Hamas in Gaza at the time. In 2022, he spoke of a flood coming, that there is a flood that will come in response to Israel's provocations at Al-Aqsa Mosque. And what Israel believed, and this is where the whole element of Netanyahu transferring the Qatari money into the Gaza Strip, right, comes into this. what Netanyahu believed is that we can quiet them down when, for instance, Ben Gvir storms Al-Aqsa Mosque, or there's a massive provocation, or we're ethnically cleansing some people, or we bomb and attack and raid Jenin, or whatever may happen, or a political prisoner from Islamic Jihad Party or Hamas is killed in prison, either due to medical neglect or he's beaten to death. We can sort of cool these things down, calm them down by allowing Qatar to bring money into the Gaza Strip so that basically there'll be more money in circulation. Hamas can work on some new building projects, etc. And the situation can sort of calm down. So even if Hamas has to give a symbolic response, it's not going to do anything major. The other thing is, this was a bold move by Hamas, an extremely bold move. You've seen the military capabilities now. I'm sure I don't know if you're keeping up with every single operation that's carried out, and they're published on a daily basis of what the armed resistance groups have in the Gaza Strip, but it's domestically produced weapons for the most part, right? Light weapons. The idea that somehow, based upon the past examples and the fact as well that in 2021 they started implementing AI technology to do risk assessment, right? They were pretty comfortable with the fact that there's no way, and there's no major provocation, right, at that time, because all the provocations happened all year, major ones. Why would they do it at this time? I was shocked. I was shocked that it happened when it did. And I'm actually somebody, and if you go back in my articles and interviews that I've done, I was asked what would be the best strategy for Hamas if they were to go over. And I laid it out. I said, dude, they'd have to go in, they'd have to take captives, number one, right, as their bargaining chip. They'd have to attack all the military sites in their way. And then they'd have to go and embed themselves in Israeli surrounding areas. And the Israelis would have to make the decision then to bomb their own people in order to get them out, or they would have to negotiate. And there's two things. And that would be a strategy, very risky, but it was very obvious, for somebody that knows what. So the Israelis knew. If I could come up with that idea in my head, the Israelis knew. And there's Israeli policy papers that you can read back into where they literally describe piece by piece of what Hamas would have to do in order to carry out such an operation. And this has not just been, a year before October 7th. We're talking about years and years back. They were discussing these things.
Well, here's what's interesting, though. So you're making an excellent case for why it just seems to be like incompetence, hubris. But that last point then kind of brings it back the other way, right? Well, they clearly then, if they, why would they then not see what they were pointing at? Or what's your logic on why they didn't respond? Or, you said the warnings come all the time, but nonetheless, like the one thing that stands out to me is the people that were on those the little watchtower points where they were all women, and they were relaying this to their leadership and saying, this is, and they're basically threatened, stop bringing this up or we're going to put you in prison. It was paraphrasing. I think it was Haaretz that wrote that article. So, those are the ones that kind of just don't really line up. They were seeing enough to where they were like incessantly going, this is not normal. We see something. And then with what you just said, with the plan being so obvious that even you could see it. So I wonder whether there, and the reason I bring this up, next point we'll get into, is the kind of civil war dynamic from obviously the Sid Tiemann discussion that's kind of caused that divide. But I wonder what's driving that from more underneath it all, right? Like, 'cause I still don't know where I stand, to be quite honest. I think it's hard to ignore how much evidence there was, but you added a good point showing apparently those things have happened a lot long before October 7th. But the idea being that it makes sense to see how some element would have wanted this to happen, not expecting the way I argue it is not expecting what actually happened, but thinking there would be a little bit of an incursion. They'd be able to use it to justify a lot. And you've seen this, you've written about this. It happens even just like Netanyahu bombing things to help himself in the political situation. This is a common tactic. So I just wonder if that was the case. It makes the most sense, I would argue, that it would come from the extremists in his, like the religious Zionism party, the religious power party, like these kind of mindsets that are very driven by the prophecies and so on, So, but go ahead and continue. I just thought that's the way I see it. And I wonder whether there might be some element of that, even though there was what you're describing.
There's so many points to address here. The first one, just to address those extremist elements in the Israeli political system. And there's extremist nut jobs in the military as well, but the military leadership and the intelligence leadership are separate from them, and they dislike them, actually. These extremist messianic types like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. They don't like these people, and these are nut jobs. They do have now power because they formed like these settler militia groups and stuff like this. So that's a separate issue. Perhaps we'll get into that when we talk about this whole civil war aspect. But addressing the October 7 situation, there's 3 things to keep in mind here. The first one is military censorship on the reports that come out in Israeli media and what can be told about what actually happened that day. So definitely there's communication, right, to Israeli higher command. It went up the levels of command, that we're under attack. We need to call them back up. They did call them back up. They launched drone strikes on their own positions. But the thing is, in a lot of cases, to openly say that the Israelis were launching drone strikes, bringing out their helicopters and shooting their own people with Hellfire missiles and, targeting buildings with tanks and indiscriminately firing in between crowds. These things are censored in the Israeli media. And so the whole timeline of what happened that day, we don't have a fully accurate timeline of the Israeli response, how long it took, when the orders were given, all of those different things on the Israeli side. But what we do know from the evidence of that day is that the Israelis did respond a lot quicker. This whole idea that they didn't respond in 6 hours is nonsense. They responded very quickly. They responded very quickly. On the ground, there were armed clashes. Most of this is the thing. It happened at 6 o'clock in the morning. A lot of people are in their military bases, in their towers and facilities. There's videos of Hamas throwing grenades into these towers and killing the Israeli soldiers inside of them, or going into facilities, and there's soldiers there literally like they've just woken up and they've just grabbed a gun because they were asleep before, and they've come out and they're getting gunned down, and all of that is there. There's evidence of that. And on top of that, the Israelis called airstrikes into different positions there. The Israelis were airstriking anyone that tried to, they saw Hamas fighters taking captives towards Gaza. They launched airstrikes on them. So it was a complete mess, and they didn't know what to do, honestly, because I don't think they anticipated such a large assault. It was very bold, the action that was taken. Number 2, when you're looking at this, is the idea of it being allowed would have to mean that Israel would have a coherent plan afterwards to implement.
Yeah, fair enough.
Israel didn't have a coherent plan afterwards. First, they went and they spoke about, we're going to annex northern Gaza. We want to push the people to southern Gaza, and we want to ethnically cleanse a large population of the Gaza Strip. And there were plans. We had leaked documents from Israeli government ministries talking about this. We had many people, Israelis publicly discussing ethnic cleansing and the annexation of northern Gaza, for instance. There are these plans that came out. And then we had all of these different military strategies which were floated. And after a while, it just became apparent that the Israeli military, it doesn't function in a disciplined way.
Yes.
People get away with whatever they want to do. Hence all the rapes in prison, right? That now Israeli society support it, at least 47% according to one poll. Then, it's not to say that might come out the same in every single poll, but the fact that there are that many people that respond to a poll, the fact that it could be the majority of the respondents saying, indicates that there is an element of Israeli society, significant one, that are in favor of doing something like that. The actions of the troops filming themselves in stealing women's underwear and all the horrible things and the war crimes that they're committing, they film themselves bragging about on camera, and then airstriking anything and anyone and launching multiple precision strikes on the World Central Kitchen and journalists, and just ridiculous, like strategically thinking, ridiculous actions. Like, for instance, they told Palestinians to go from the north to the south. People started going. Then they launched airstrikes on them. So then they were like, okay, we're staying in the north then. Right? And then it was like, okay, well, if you stay in the north, you're going to starve. But then the people in the south started starving. The people in the north started getting a little bit more aid. So nothing is coherent. The plan that they've enacted, it has inflicted so much damage over such a long period, and no one has any coherent strategy to get them out of this, that it doesn't make sense that they planned it. And if they did plan it, then that would implicate the United States. There's no way the United States did not know that Israel would have a plan like this, for instance. I think what happened, this happened The Israelis freaked out. For instance, I think I gave you this example before. I was in Palestine one time, and a friend of mine from Scotland, he decided that he wanted to go to Gaza without a permit to go to Gaza, right? So he took all these buses and he walked through all these settlements, and he got to the Erez crossing area at around 8 o'clock at night, roughly. I know the time because he was wearing this watch, which was recording the whole event, right?
Sure.
He was walking around for about 30 minutes. I watched all this footage. I literally, because on a plane, you know, I was on a plane, I had nothing to do. I was like, okay, I'm going to watch all this footage on my laptop to see the whole thing all the way through. You know, I was there, you know, snacking and watching what was happening. He was walking around that military site for half an hour. Just under half an hour before he was surrounded by about 13 to 15 Israeli soldiers with guns. If he could walk around that site for that long, then their security isn't that great. Number one. Number two, Palestinians consistently cross or did before cross that fence, sometimes to get to work, because there is a small portion, a few thousand Palestinians, and the number would go up and down depending upon how many permits the Israelis would allow, which, you know, they're very poor and they want to work. So they would cross for the Erez crossing and then go to work, or another crossing, and go to work in the Israeli settlements, right? And sometimes they wouldn't be able to get there. So they'd literally just jump the fence. And I know of people who have jumped the fence and gone to work. So the whole idea that Israel, like its technology is above and beyond, and the soldiers are on. I'll give you an example, another example, okay? When the balloons were being flown over, Israel boasted this iron beam technology, which was battle tested, and it was supposed to be able to take out mortars and anti-tank guided munitions, right? And it was this wonderful technology that Israel's come out with, the Iron Dome. It's a laser that shoots down all these munitions, right? They said, so magnificent. So after its successful tests, they then used it and they tried to shoot down balloons with, you know, burning objects, incendiary objects, which were set off from Gaza, kids in Gaza who set it off to the Israeli side to set fires, right? It didn't work to even bring down a balloon. And the soldiers are standing there, there's videos of them from the time, standing there trying to shoot at the balloons, right? So this whole idea, look, their soldiers are not that well trained. They're very dopey. They're not that well disciplined. They receive orders often. They were receiving orders. And there were reports about this. The Israeli generals were complaining about how ridiculous it is that they're receiving orders. Soldiers are receiving orders on WhatsApp. And sometimes they're ignoring them. So this whole idea of the invincible Israeli and the powerful Israeli, they relied heavily on technology. And they had all these threats, but they have these threat levels going up and up and up all the time. And that's the thing that a lot of people don't understand, is like, you can't just look at one incident. What is the threat level presented by the Israelis everywhere, right? Similar threats, for instance, have been interpreted as coming from Lebanon at one point, or Syria at another point. And so they have different security assessments, and they have obviously the reconnaissance, and they calculate all this, and they're putting this now into AI technology, into computers, and the computer is generating like a probability, a percentage of this and this. And then an intelligence officer goes over it and goes, you know, they're training, they're doing active firing drills. Yeah, they're like working to break in through the fence. But at the end of the day, they've been doing this for years. You know, Hamas pulled off operations cross the separation fence in tunnels, for instance, and through their Nukhba forces, their naval forces, scuba divers, into military sites before in like 2014. So they didn't expect something at this scale. They didn't expect something so comprehensive, and they reacted to it. And they did have a reaction to it. Now, the reaction was awful, and they killed many of their own people. And we now know that. Now, coming up with a statistic for that, I would just be estimating, and there's not much value, but a significant portion of them, you can look at the evidence, go through it yourself. We now know Hannibal, the Hannibal directive was actually triggered, right? So that indicates, if the Hannibal directive is triggered, that indicates that they're in trouble. And they knew they were in trouble. And so they freaked out. And like, these tank operators were just firing munitions into buildings, right? And they weren't negotiating. They didn't know what to do. They had no idea what was even happening and how many people had come over, because the first thing Hamas did was it used its drones to hit all of the power points and military gun towers along the perimeter of the fence before. And they used these drones and they smashed all of these facilities, and then they came through. And at the end of the day, it shows that this technology is not all that it's cracked up to be. And for me, given the blow that Israel has been dealt on October 7 and now after October 7, I don't think it has a coherent strategy, and I don't think it planned this out. I think Israel uses this. It used this opportunity, and that's why we saw all the ridiculous, really stupid propaganda. You know, at one point it was like, we found like a Mein Kampf book in like you know, a child's room, right? And that justifies like they're teaching their children Hitler, you know, like just stupid stuff, and Al-Qaeda documents and all of this nonsense, right?
Those are the ones I find. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. So sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to quickly say those are the ones I find to be the most stupid. The ones that were the chemical weapons instructions that turn out to be the cover of some book from Amazon, or, you know, like just the most easily debunkable nonsense. But go ahead. It's just laughable. Important to point out how they think they can even get away with that. It's exactly the point you're making. In fact, the hubris that leads them to think they can do something that easily disprovable.
And that's the thing. When Israel, like in the past, when Israel plans a military operation, the propaganda is already set. They know how to build it up. They know how to set up their arguments. Everything is there down to a T. Like, they're meticulous planners when it comes to an operation that they prepare for. But when they're responding, they perform poorly, like happened in 2021.
That's interesting, because one of the things I keep saying, and you're right, this does seem at least, you know, different than what I've seen in the past, is that everything they seem to be doing post October 7th is very reactive and clumsy in that way, right? Where you've got the Elon Levies of the world, the, you know, the people online that are just jumping out. Like, what you'll see is an event that happens, and then they like scramble to get some kind of patched together, cobbled narrative that ends up being 3 different directions. And they let you choose which one you like. You know, it's very reactive. So yeah, you know, you're making a really good case for the Hannibal directive. I think is a great point, because that's the indication that this is a, you know, we're in trouble. It's a response to something that's going wrong. So very interesting, you know. So let's end with this in regard to the Sid Tiaman prison torture rape discussion, but how that led to, and you've covered this as well, I believe I've got your tweet here, the sort of the rise of this like civil war discussion, which I saw a lot of pushback from Israelis saying, well, that's a little bit, you know, much to say it's a civil war. But I've seen a lot of good analysis around this that suggests, like Scott Ritter made a great point, then the next day it seems he was raided, which is an interesting coincidence, but about this legitimately getting to the level of a civil war conversation. And I have an article from Zero Hedge I want to read you a section from that very point, pointing out the rabbi of Gvir and different these basically showing of this weird control of all of these settler like gangs that then puts this, you know, or painting a picture that there very well may be some kind of power divide. So speak to that point, as well as we already kind of addressed the prison, but if you have any points on that, the rape conversation, and, you know, how this might be building to some kind of an actual civil war. Do you think that's likely possible?
It's growing towards, it's heading towards that situation of possibly a civil war being in the conversation. I don't think we're there. I don't see that breaking out at this point. The reason why I don't think that will happen now is because, one, Netanyahu's government is in power, and the opposition side aren't quite as radical. But what happened, and you can trace this back to really 2005, where the Israeli settler movement became extremely radical, because a few thousand settlers were evacuated from the Gaza Strip. They dismantled the settlements, and they decided to besiege Gaza instead of occupying it internally, because there's just such staunch resistance. And during the Second Intifada, although the Israelis were able to crush the armed factions in the West Bank, Hamas had formed a stronghold inside of Gaza, especially in areas like Jabalia and Shujaiya and these areas right in the north, but in other areas as well. And so even though like they weren't that powerful at the time, these armed groups, they were still a major threat. And religiously for the Israelis, Gaza is not that important. The West Bank is hugely important. You'll hear them talk about Judea and Samaria, which is what they call the West Bank, is the biblical heartland of Israel, right? That's what they'll talk about, because it's very important for them, right? And it's important for these messianic, insane settlers. So these settlers got very angry when they saw that the Israeli government would withdraw settlers from their settlements. They got very angry, and they started to put a lot more funds, and there were a lot more projects created to build the settler movement, to build its strength. And eventually, you know, like obviously I don't want to go for the entire history of it. Obviously the settler population grew massively. These projects grew massively. And now we're at a point where there are armed settler militias, which are part of, you know, the Israeli security apparatus now, that are
which makes them a legal target
military.
from a military perspective, right?
Sorry, say
That makes
again.
them illegal targets. If from a military perspective, that makes them legal targets, correct?
Absolutely. These are militia groups.
Right,
And so
right.
you now have these militia groups which exist of hardline, insane settlers, right-wing nut jobs, who are, you know, Jewish supremacists through and through, want to expel all the Palestinians. And these people are, they have militias. They have private militias, like independent militia groups that they have, right? They have militias which have been integrated into the security apparatus and are being built up, right, with the help of the Israeli government. And then you have, for instance, units like the Desert Frontier, which was created in the West Bank out of the hardest of hardline settlers who were literally even attacking Israeli soldiers because they wouldn't let them kill enough Palestinians and throw acid on them and throw stones through moving cars and kill Palestinians and burn down their homes, right? Because, you know, they would just try and control them because they know this violence could spiral. And they attack soldiers. So even in the Israeli press, if you look back a decade ago, these settlers are called like terrorists, right? Now they have a unit for them in the Israeli military, which is just for them. And they're able to run amok. And now the settlers are allying with the soldiers, and a lot of the settlers are soldiers, right? So there's a lot of crossover. And now not only that, we're looking at the people who are really motivated to vote and the populations that are growing, the population size that is growing of these settlers and the people connected to them now and how mainstream that settler population is and the influence it has on Israeli society. Now these are the mainstream political parties, like Kahanist parties, we call them. So there was Meir Kahane, who birthed what's known as the KAK movement. That the armed wing of it is called the JDL, the Jewish Defense League, which was registered as a terrorist organization in the United States, carried out bombing attacks on people and all sorts of stuff, right? It murdered a lot of innocent people. And so that movement was banned. Eventually, he was Kahane was a member of the Israeli Knesset. He was then banned from running in elections because he was just an extremist, and he was eventually assassinated. But the people who are the ideological inheritors of Kahanism, as it was, formed their own parties, and this influenced the settler movement. And they're receiving massive amounts of funds from charitable organizations in the United States or even from the Israeli government. And so Netanyahu, he saw this opportunity with this, that he wanted to weaponize this and use it to his own benefit politically. It was a very short-term approach, however, because now he's sort of, it's bad for him. It's detrimental, but now he's built a monster which he cannot defeat because now it's in the Israeli government. They're the second religious Zionism, that alliance in the Israeli government is the second largest party in the ruling coalition after Likud party. It's the third most in terms of total amount of votes that it got of any bloc in the Israeli election, but the second in the ruling coalition. And so they have political power. They have security power. Ben-Gvir's security minister, he was given special role in the West Bank. The finance minister is Bezalel Smotrich. The reason why he's a finance minister is so that he can put money into projects of Judaization in either the Galilee or the Naqab or in the West Bank, for instance, with settlement projects.
And wasn't he given like a special authority in regard to these settlements and the creation of them that kind of supersedes like the government itself? Is that am I saying that correctly? Like, so I read something about that they gave him some kind of special authority where nobody else could essentially stop him. Is that correct?
He has power over Kogat. So like over the governing authority in the West Bank who make decisions with the West Bank. So, for instance, on like settlement expansion, right? And now they've made it so it just goes straight through him. So there's even less of a process. So he can essentially control settlement expansion, certain policies towards the settlements, right? And now they're, you know, bringing those settlements into under Israeli law. So they're annexing the settlements, and so these people have an enormous amount of power now. And the reason, and this was a long way of explaining it, but the reason why this influences the whole civil war conversation is because these people are religious, hardline settler fanatics who don't have a rational thinking brain cell between them. They think the Palestinian Authority is their enemy. The Palestinian Authority is their friend. They keep the stability in the West Bank for them. But they don't like the fact that the Palestinian Authority will not sell out on the issue of wanting a state. Of course, there wouldn't be, there's no use for them if they didn't want a state, right? And they are the most radical of radicals. And these people also want to make the Israeli legal system, they want to change it. And they want to make it more religious, right? And they want to have sort of a theocracy and have Israel as a theocracy for, you know, and to serve the interests of like religious far-right Jewish supremacy. And these people openly advocate the most disgusting positions imaginable. Whereas then you have the right-wing Israeli camp, because they're all right-wing, right? They're all like on the right. They try and say, for instance, the Meretz party, which tries to say that it's, you know, liberal Zionist. The head of Meretz just came out yesterday and said that we should build settlements and annex or occupy southern Lebanon, right? That these are your moderates, okay? The most moderate. Like we're talking about Meretz is a small party with a handful of like Knesset members, and right there they're like the left. When Netanyahu goes off, the left, right? That's who the left are, you know. That's their position. But now we're looking at this situation where that right side, so your Benny Gantz's and you know. Even Gideon Sar to an extent, Victor Lieberman, Yair Lapid, Naftali Bennett, these sort of people on that other side, right? You know, some of whom are religious, but most of them not, don't want Israel to go in that direction. They want it to be, you know, that secular liberal democracy only for its Jewish population. And that's what they want it to remain as. And they feel like they're under attack and that there's a Judaization process going on within the government. And so these two sides are clashing. The problem, in my opinion, will be for them and the prospect of civil war is when these armed settler militias, when they're no longer in power, their guys are not in power, these armed settler militias feel really threatened. We've already seen what the sort of stuff that these settlers do just for those 10 gang rapists. But you imagine that they're pushing much harder on these people. And what's going to happen? They're probably going to storm military facilities, government buildings, and probably shoot people. We've seen them running people over with cars. So it could, you know, escalate.
Didn't this already happen recently? Let me see we'll just go to this Zero Hedge article and what it's reporting. And this is we can end on this point in general. It's real actually, before we even go to that, I wanted to show this article you wrote, which discusses the actions of these people, which the title is Israeli settlers consistently use arson attacks to burn Palestinians alive right up to today. The Desert Group you mentioned, that was the one they pretended to sanction, I believe, and then Smotrich spoke up and they just pulled it back if that was even legitimately going to happen in the first place, showing that the U.S. government is very aware of all this. But so here is a Zero Hedge article that I find interesting. And so the first part, which we'll get into the part about the rabbi, it says, so too overlooked in the West will be that which happened in Israel on the same day that the assassinations later took place. Right-wing vigilantes descended from their settlements, storming 2 military IDF bases. They're using anarchy incorrectly. The chaotic scenes of mass break-ins fomented by several members of the ruling coalition, some of whom took part in the forcible entries, sparked angry condemnation. So are you familiar with that? Or is this maybe exactly what you're talking about?
This specific issue, I don't.
Let me click the link here. We can look at it live and see if this is so this is from the 29th of July. Oh, this has to do with specifically. Okay, so I misread it. I was thinking it meant bases that they continue to. But the reason I misread it is because they do seem to say down here that they basically now continue to occupy or maintain positions in this location. So, I mean, I guess I'm reading this as coming off of the conversation we were discussing of the torture, the prison camps and how the people are being raped, that this has become like this sparked issue that's much bigger than that, but it's already kind of beginning like what you just described, that they're essentially, you know, you can see how this can boil out to where they're going to start choosing sides, right? To where now we're going to take these locations so we can control them. And I mean, what is that if not a civil war? That at least is seemingly beginning, you know? And what are your thoughts on that before I go to this last part?
Well, yeah, that's like, this is the danger that it will escalate in this way. So like, for instance, in this case, you have them storming these military facilities because they're appalled that their soldiers are being held accountable for anything, right? They think their soldiers are beyond reproach, that they're heroes no matter what. They can do anything, commit any war crimes they like, and it's against Palestinians. So, you know, no one is going to hold them accountable. Then nobody should hold them accountable. And this has been happening for a very long time. I mean, the Israelis never hold their soldiers accountable. That's why there's such shock and awe, because they're like, oh my God, they're holding them accountable for something serious this time. You know, before, Palestinians, for instance, were held as human shields, I believe, in the 2008-9 war. And then in 2010, finally a charge came through for 2 soldiers. They got, you know, a few months in jail, and they were demoted. They were allowed to remain in the military. The worst crime, according to the Israeli judicial system, that was punished, the soldier was punished for in the 2008-9 war, right? The worst crime. And keep in mind now, we just said there's a case of them actually pursuing human shield taking. They took a child as a human shield, right. Which was proven. The worst thing, like the worst punishment, was dished out to a soldier who stole a credit card and used to pay for things with it in Tel Aviv. That was the worst punishment, you know. So they'll punish them for small little things like that. I remember once there's a video of a soldier stealing an apple in Al Khalil, a city in the West Bank, and they brought a case against him for stealing an apple. But you know, they just executed Palestinians, you know, a few days before, and nothing happened, right? So it's like this whole thing, like, oh, our soldiers are the most moral army in the world, you know, and everything we do is justified. And there are some people, see, look, we prosecute people for stealing apples and credit cards, you know, so we're good. Look at us, even small crimes like apples and credit cards. Could you imagine any other army prosecuting for such a crime? We're so moral. But, you know, that allows them to live in this little delusional bubble that they live in. And then when someone is actually prosecuted for perhaps one of the most heinous crimes you can imagine, gang raping a defenseless prisoner who's held without a charge. I mean, that's one of the most heinous crimes that you can commit. They're out there defending them. Because well, there are soldiers, there are Jewish soldiers, and how dare you talk about the Israeli army and say it's not the most moral army in the world? We're the most moral. We're allowed to do, because they're terrorists, so we're allowed to do anything we want. So it's
they're making arguments on live TV. I'm sure you've seen that, right? Where they're like not some of the actual people on the show, but then people they invite on as well. And again, that was my point earlier. There was some pushback. People that are going, "That's terrible. I can't believe you saying this." But standing there forcefully saying that, of course, they should be raped. They should do whatever they want to them. And then like doubling and tripling down when people even came in to try to give him an out. They were like, "Well, I don't think he means that it's okay." And he goes, "No, yes, I do." Like push right back on him. I mean, it's everywhere, as I'm sure you've seen.
And this is the thing. It's a sick and twisted society that this conversation can be going on at any level of the society. Now, there is an argument, well, there's loads of different things that horrible things that have been done in the past by the US military and the French and the British. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. But I haven't seen a poll come back, a television poll come back, where American citizens, after seeing a video of U.S. soldiers gang raping Iraqi prisoner, for instance, them coming back and the majority of them polled saying that they support it.
It's like Guantanamo. Yeah, it's like Guantanamo, where we saw clearly the vast majority of people were outraged, but there were some that clearly were trying to rationalize and advocate. But you're right, the vast majority, what I think about this is that clearly I think this is exactly what the U.S. government would love to turn us into, to create what Israel has turned their people into, but, essentially allowing them to do whatever they want. But instead, the U.S. government's in the position where they're constantly having to pretend to be the thing that they convince us they are, right? It's an interesting overlap. But let me play this clip from Scott Ritter. And this is the clip the day before, or the day after, rather, is when they raided. I don't think even the stated conversation is more about Russia and the FAR Act, but who knows if the timing had to do with this as well. But I want to play this clip where he overlaps this with it's the same point. That there's like a religious aspect to this, of the people that believe, let's say, the Talmud in this point is what gives them the right to do this to certain people, and then people that disagree with that. And then I'll read this clip and we can kind of end on that point. So here's what Ritter was reporting.
On perverted parody. When the Israelis jail 9 soldiers for raping Palestinian prisoners, and then Israeli citizens rise up and say that the Talmud interpretation of a Jewish law says it's not a crime to rape non-Jews, and that these men should be freed. Not only that, then they sent hundreds of people to the Palestinian prisons demanding to be allowed in so they can rape the Palestinian prisoners because they're permitted to under Jewish law. This led to a near civil war in Israel, where soldiers were facing off against soldiers. This isn't bad Hollywood movie. This isn't the preface to some sort of zombie apocalypse. This is reality happening in Israel right now. Our ally. We claim that Israel and America is alike in many ways. I don't know, when was the last time 500 American citizens stormed a state prison saying we need to be allowed in to rape the prisoners because we're permitted to under our religious beliefs? That's happening in Israel as we speak. The 9 soldiers were released now from custody. They're not going to be charged with a crime because apparently in Israel, raping prisoners is no longer a crime. That's just one thing. They're blowing up. They blew up a school today with students in it. The school burned. The students were inside the school burning to death. The parents were outside listening as their children screamed as they were burned to death. That happens on a daily basis. What Israel has become literally the worst incarnation of what we could imagine Nazi Germany was like back in the day. I mean, it's.
Now he got a lot of pushback for saying, he went on to after that make the point in this about how he argues that Hitler was worse or something, but based on the amount of people. But, the point is simply the same as anybody who cannot recognize that objectively what they're doing is anything we've heard out of horror stories of World War II, then you're just lying to yourself. I mean, it's exactly what's happening. That I think is an interesting overlap, because the point being that not just that they think that we're right because they're the bad guy, but there's a much deeper, as you were highlighting, a belief in this, that this is somehow not just the revenge, but permitted, or rather glorified even. I mean, Smotrich, I believe, called them heroes, right? Mm-hmm. So this point is from the Zero Hedge article. And this is what I'll just show you that I had highlighted here. It says, so I'm not even sure how to pronounce that word, the right-wing cult now holds the majority in cabinet, and it says, and wields a vigilante militia ready to attack the military establishment and the Israeli state. It says no one was arrested for the attack and takeover of these 2 bases. They do not dare. And it says Moshe, or Bogi Yalon, former chief of staff of the IDF, who also served as an Israeli's defense minister, had this to say in a video interview on the forces taking over Israel. So it's the current of what just happened. Quote, he says, when you talk about Smotrich Ben Gvir, they have a rabbi. His name is Dov Lior. He is a rabbi of the Jewish underground who intended to blow up the Dome of the Rock. This gets to as you know, the prophecy conversations of the Third Temple. And before that, the buses in Jerusalem. He says, why? In order to hurry up the last war. That's the prophecy discussion. He says, do you not hear them talking in terms of the last war or of Smotrich's concept of subjugation? Read the article he published and says, first of all, this concept rests on Jewish supremacy. And this is the crazy part to me. And this is good. This is a Israeli Jew who was served in the military. He says, Mein Kampf in reverse. He says, quote, my hair stands on end when I say that, as he said it. So he's claiming that's what they said. Literally claiming we're doing the same thing in reverse. But he says, I learned and grew up in a house of Holocaust survivors and, quote, never again. He says it is Mein Kampf in reverse, Jewish supremacy. And therefore, Smotrich says, quote, my wife won't go in a room with an Arab. Then it goes on after the quote, it is anchored in ideology. And then actually, what he aspires to as soon as possible to go to a big war, a war of Gog and Magog. He says, how do you start the flames? A massacre like the Cave of the Patriarchs, 1994. He says, Barash Goldstein is a student of this rabbi. Ben Gvir has hung up Goldstein's picture in his house. This is what goes on in the decision-making process in the Israeli government. Rabbi Dor Lior has been described by Netanyahu as, quote, elite unit that leads Israel because of his influence and control over the settler forces. The 1948 Irgun drawing heavily on Mizraim's is it being reborn? And that's the point they're making of this entire article. Is this simply the recreation, being reborn of the Irgun, the darkest part, arguably, of kind of like the origins of Zionism before the state creation of Israel and the horrifying things that were done and really have continued to be done. So I want your kind of thoughts on that as we end up here, because we've already discussed it, this religious divide, the possible civil war, but that seems to be pretty hard to miss. One side of this being led by the kind of religious extremists seemingly having control over the settler forces, as you highlighted, then the other side of this being, I don't even know how you'd frame it. You did a good job a second ago, but they all seem crazy to me. But, how do you see this playing out? Because it seems almost likely this is going to happen.
There's a lot to break down there.
Yeah.
So I'd say that if you're looking at this situation, for instance, the Likud party, as it now is today, was sort of like an outgrowth of the revisionist Zionist camp, which was opposed to Ben Gurion, and the mainstream sort of Zionist vision. Of course, inbuilt, as Benny Morris writes, inbuilt into Zionism was the idea of what he calls transfer, which is ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population. But they came to a point where the Oslo Accords were on the table, and the Oslo Accords were for creating a two-state solution. I'm trying to summarize this as best as possible. The Likud party, which was with the revisionist Zionist camp, always more radical, they saw an opportunity to build power, right? Specifically, Benjamin Netanyahu coming up at this time, right? And stirring a lot of chaos. And so he wanted to take control, right? And obviously they wanted to make sure that there would be no possibility of there being a creation of a Palestinian state, right? But they had that option. If they, at that time, did a two-state solution, I believe Israel could actually have continued to exist.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you take into consideration demographics and just the inevitability of armed struggle, and then their aggressive actions and what they've done and what they've paved the way for themselves, it was naturally going to go into the direction of extermination and ethnic cleansing of the population once again. They have to do it in order to maintain. What Netanyahu did, he was having a lot of trouble for years, I think, since 2018, I think it was. He was having a lot of trouble forming a coalition, right? Because he made a lot of political enemies. That's why he was having a problem. He was always like the most famous Israeli politician, and he, the most popular Israeli politician over others, even though at the same time being one of the most hated, because he did make these enemies. So he decided to invest a lot of energy into building up this extremist movement of settlers.
Is this right about the time when all the indictments were coming down on him? Is that kind of the pressure from that side of it too?
He had been building that movement and he had been helping it before, but yes, that's when the corruption charges are flying at him and he's struggling to make a coalition and he's in and out of government and there's constant elections. They had like 5 and 4 years. And so he's really struggling and he's, pulling every string he can to make sure that he maintains power specifically. And he controls the Likud party. And as he's doing this, he's allowing that settler movement, which he helped build to help him personally and his party politically, he allowed them to enter politics in a major way, and he backed them entering politics in a major way and enabled them to grow. And these people that we're talking about now, and that Scott Ritter mentioned, like the Talmudic ideology that they have, these people genuinely believe in these end-day prophecies that we need to expel every single Palestinian from the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority is our enemy because the Palestinian Authority dares to even lay claim to the Jewish heartland. And all of these insane theories that they have, including, for instance, near Nablus, there is a settlement, I think it's called Yitzhak, where they have these hardline yeshuv where they're essentially teaching, these rabbis teach that you can rape a non-Jewish child, and every tear that comes out of the eye is, as if the virginity is, these sort of insane things. You can literally rape and kill Arab children, like is the message that they're presented. And this is not, way out there. This is what they believe.
Right.
Like, this is actually what they believe. So it's no surprise, really, if we look at it, why they're supporting the idea of soldiers gang raping a Palestinian in detention, of course, like, because under their ideology, that's fine. That's okay. But what happened is, now that element was never inbuilt into Zionism. That's been added later on. This messianic religious philosophy, that's more new. That's over the past few decades that's actually rose to prominence now.
Are you saying in regards to specifically Israelis' version of this, or Zionism in general?
I would say, like, always you had religious Zionists, like a small group of them at first. For instance, Theodor Herzl hated religious Jewish people. He, suggested at one point a mass conversion to Christianity and tried to organize something with the Pope, right? Because his whole idea was like solving the Jewish question. Like, how are we going to solve the Jewish question? And he was secular. And if you look at those early Zionists, they're all secular. All of them. They hate religious Jewish people.
Super important. Sorry, go ahead. That's just very important for my audience. We've been talking about this a lot, and the idea that, it's Zionism is a manipulation of whether it's Christianity or Judaism. But I think you're making that point clear. So go ahead.
And it's similar. I mean, look, there's an example. It goes back a very long way. But if you look at the Crusades, you look at the indigenous Christian populations. I'll take the example of the Armenians. The Armenians ended up resisting the Crusaders, even though they're fellow Christians, so-called, right? But the ideology of those Crusaders was just insanity. Like, the things that they were doing, the mass rapes, bathing in blood, the horrible things that they did, right? So the local Christian population were looking at them and going, we should side with the Muslims because this is just disgusting. And even, you had Crusader rulers who married into the Armenian side, and they switched sides. So specifically one female ruler, I forgot her name. She was a Crusader ruler. Real quick,
I just want to shout this out since there's a gap. But Matt Ehret just put up an excellent article about kind of the kind of occult ritualistic aspects of the recent Olympics discussion. And in that article, he does an amazing job going back to like this conversation back to, the same time period, Knights Templar and this kind of pagan influence in that. Like, so that's exactly the point you're making. I'm not going to do the best way of describing it right now, but how interesting it is that, like you said, bathing in blood. I mean, the idea is that we perceive them as some kind of Christian entity, but there was a lot of influence, if not infiltration, from these like pagan, not Christians, essentially, even at that time. And so that's interesting that you highlight that.
And that's the thing. Even Zionism played on a certain interpretation of Christianity as well. And so that's the thing. And Christianity has been used in order to colonize the Americas. It was used for colonization all over the world. It's still used right today in forms of Christianity and different splinters off of mainstream Christianity, like Mormonism, for instance, right? That's used in its own way. So there's loads of different ways that religion is used and utilized. And, different religious movements get to certain degrees of horrifying atrocities that they can justify. With the Israeli experience, Israel as an idea was essentially, we're being persecuted in Europe, right? Meaning we as the Jews are being persecuted in Europe. We need a homeland somewhere. And so basically, look at these Europeans that, we've been having all these problems with. Well, they're going and colonizing all of these countries all over the world and killing their native populations and taking their resources and everything. And look at the American experiment. Look how successful that is. Look at South Africa. So successful. The South Africans, they were, persecuted Europeans. So we need to go somewhere else and make a homeland for ourselves there, right? And the whole idea as well with the Pinot Noir of the... in Algeria, right? They sent the settlers to Algeria. These are all like groups that are economically disadvantaged or persecuted Europeans that have gone over to another country. And so the Zionists set up colonization offices, right? Zionist colonization offices. They wanted to colonize. They wanted to conquer. Originally, it was Napoleon that gave the idea for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. partly because he failed to conquer northern Palestine, right? So he gave that idea. And when that got over to this banking class of people, especially after the birth of the Federal Reserve system, with, like, obviously they set forth the Aldrich Plan, and World War I really became a big thing. So these figures like the Rothschilds became very powerful. They backed this idea and they put money into this idea. And so originally it's like, we need to get away from the Jew as the Jew is in Europe, because that's the persecuted Jew. We need to become like European colonizer. And you look at their literature, they talk about this creating the new Israeli. They changed all their names. All their names are changed to make them more like Hebrew, right? They wouldn't let them speak Yiddish when the settlers went over there. They didn't want them to speak Yiddish or German or Russian. Or no, we are going to speak Hebrew. It's our own language. So they've created this nationalism, which inbuilt must be the extermination, the subjugation, or the ethnic cleansing of the native population in order to take that land. So you have that. And then the background of persecution behind it. And then the constant reminders which drive the movement to continue taking and to continue attacking and continue subjugating and justifying the oppression of the native population, which is in their ears constantly, promoting this idea. Not only are you the aggressor, not only are you the smartest and the strongest and this new type of advanced European Jew, now the Israeli, right? This wonderful Israel, but also you are persecuted. And if you don't do what you're doing, you're all going to die. You're all going to die. And what's happened with that ultranationalism, that racial supremacy element, and then on top of that now, you've added in with the settler movement a religious element to this. And it's not to say that there weren't always secret societies with their weird justifications for things, which were involved in projects like this. But we're looking at the Israeli society, the Zionist public, the Israeli public, and what it's done. And now we're at a point where they've been sent into just an insane lunatic state of mind. I would
add that they have been given more power than they ever had before. Like you're saying, they got brought into the leadership. And so now that you have the dangerous element of what they've always been, now they have the power to see it through. That's the way I see that playing out. And that's terrifying.
And if you look at, for instance, these are different circumstances. And now the difference is we have cameras on everything. We're seeing daily updates. We know exactly what's going on minute by minute. But look at the South Africans when apartheid was about to fall. And look at the excuses they made. They're gonna kill us. The black people are gonna kill us. They're gonna take us over. We have nowhere else to go. And the South Africans, by the way, the white South Africans, they've been there for as long as the American settlers had been there, right? They were back. It was a very similar time period. A lot of people think apartheid South Africa, well, obviously the implementation of apartheid was a lot more recent, but it was there. It was about just as old as the United States. It's about as old as the United States. And the arguments were the same because unlike the United States, where now the population distribution, the demographics are favorable to the newly birthed country, we have in South Africa that the majority of the population are not white South Africans. And so they had to create a tier system. And the way they justify it, it's the same sort of psychopathy that you have from the Israelis. However, apartheid South Africa ended. And it ended at a crucial stage when it started to become very, very violent. When they started to massacre innocent people, and they had the people in the Bantu stands, and they'd set up this really intense system, it fell. The Israelis have been able to go to the very, very, very end of this experience and this experiment, and they didn't accept any compromise. If they accepted the two-state solution, we might be talking about a different situation now. I believe that if you had it, it could have worked because the Palestinian Authority, look at what it's doing today. If that still same Palestinian Authority is there in a state side by side, there might not actually be much resistance at all, right? And we might be in a completely different situation. But what they've done is they've headed into a really dark experiment and era. And now they have basically no option but to keep fighting until the death of them. And that's what they see. It's the back against the wall, fight for the survival of the nation. And behind this is similar to the South Africans and the other settler populations. Similar to it is this idea of our persecution and what happened to us and what's going to happen to us next, right? But because of the way they've been pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed like this, now you have this most insane experiment, which is just committing some of the most heinous crimes we've ever seen, and on camera every single day. We've never seen it like this before. This is a unique time in history and a unique genocide in terms of it's carried out with modern weapons in a modern world where the colonial era is behind us. That all ended. That's over. You know, we're talking about like all of that was done. So, you know, most people, you know, weren't like now people that are looking at this, they weren't alive back in that era. We don't remember what it was like when the British, you know, occupied Egypt, or the French occupied Algeria until the 1960s when they got independent. We don't remember that. So that's behind us. We think that we're more civilized. But this is that one remaining experiment, which was always going to come to this point where they had to interact. They had to make that decision. Either you're going to become one state, you're not going to be a majority. It's not really going to be the Israel you wanted anymore. Or you're going to exterminate and ethnically cleanse. And now that point has come.
It's clear what they chose. Yeah. Well, I mean, I would actually argue that I think that what Israel is in many ways represents what I think our governments are in truth. And that there's been a lot of manipulation and projection about what they want us to think they are so they can continue doing. I mean, it's as easy as looking at what the U.S. government has done in their foreign policy as far back as you want to look. You know, it's the same old colonial settler colonialism that we've seen, you know, over there, though. Right? We have narratives we tell ourselves. It's the same thing going on in Israel, but a much more, you know, I still like point I made before. I think that they were less successful in convincing and driving Americans to become the thing that makes that more amenable to what they want. But that's just my personal opinion. But either way you look at it, what you're describing is very clear. And let's not forget, by the way, for those who don't know, Israel was acutely involved with South Africa apartheid, which is not that surprising when you really look at it, you know? Let's bring this to the final point here. And so with what you described there, which is very clear, you know, do you see this boiling into some kind of a civil war, or do you see this more going into the idea, what you described, of some outside force, whoever that may be, putting a stop to this? And within the civil war part, you know, is it people seeing that this is wrong and trying to stop it, or people who just want to maintain what they have and don't want this to get as crazy as it's going? You know, sorry, two questions there. Go ahead.
I believe at this point, it's likely that it's going to head into at least a brief regional battle, which we'll find out whether Israel is willing to make the concession and do a ceasefire and focus its attention more on the West Bank, try and extract its victory there in the West Bank. If that doesn't happen, Israel may be destroyed by force. And at that point, we are looking at a situation where they most likely will try and use their nuclear weapons. If they're not willing to use their nuclear weapons, or they're not able to use their nuclear weapons, what will likely happen, and this is just my opinion, this is not based upon any information that I have at hand, but this is my opinion. I think perhaps if we see Hezbollah and other forces pouring over the border and it looks like the Israeli military is collapsing and it's over, I think the Jordanian army, the Egyptian army, and perhaps the Turks will send their armed forces into the land of Palestine or Israel proper in order to secure that territory, to stop it from falling, and also give safe passage to Israeli citizens that want to leave. Otherwise, and that would be the only way to hold it, because Hezbollah and these Arab forces are not going to get involved in an armed conflict with Jordanian and Egyptian forces or Turkish forces. They're not going to be killing them. They don't.
So like a transition force, but multiple countries involved, like to make sure that it peacefully transitions away from this conflict. Is that how you're describing it?
Yeah, I think that's very possible. And that might be where the whole Turkish threat of will invade or whatever. It's not going to be an invasion to take over Israel and destroy it. No way. The Turkish government would never do that. But I believe that there is a very large chance that if things go sideways for the Israelis and it looks like it's about to collapse, those armies will come in, because the American forces, number one, they couldn't muster a force big enough to do anything. And number two, those forces like Hezbollah, they have no problem fighting American soldiers. But they won't fight Jordanian and Egyptian soldiers en masse like that. I don't see them launching, a full scale attack on them. I can't see that happening. But I believe that could be a strategy implemented instead of the nuclear weapons option, which might be able to preserve Israel to an extent. And maybe then they try and enforce like a two-state solution. But again, these are all just predictions. These are all just my analysis of this. There's many different ways it can go. But I think Israel has to be forced to stop in some way or another. It's not going to stop by itself. And we're heading into an era of more conflict. As for the civil war question, if this conflict ends, there's a very high chance that things will become very complex, especially if Israel cannot demonstrate any victory.
Right.
And Hamas is still there, and Hezbollah is still there, and Iran is still appearing strong. I think it's going to be very difficult, and they could disintegrate from within. It's possible. But regardless, I think we're heading into a period of more tension, and unfortunately, it's not going to be de-escalating soon, in my opinion.
That's unfortunate. And to be clear, this is a dire prediction, but obviously the responsibility for why this has to be the way it goes is because of the one, actions of the belligerent Israeli government, and two, because of the allowance by Western governments, right? By the UK, by the United States, and the arming of this, the lying, the obfuscation of damn near every aspect of it. And so that responsibility needs to always be remembered. So, I think that's just a good place to end on. My worry is that, with what you described there, how that could possibly involve Israel, like what they've seen with every element of their power structure in some way or another is involved and okay with what's happening. How that could possibly end up being positive if all it becomes a sort of self-preservation, but you still have the mindset that these people are lesser than, it's like it's built on an inherent racist ideology. So it just worries me that the kind of transition process, how that could be, like, I guess my worry point to end on is what you highlighted. Now I was just going to include this tweet that I had. You got tweets like this coming from obviously nobody with official capacity, but people that are wild pro-Israel Zionist promoter who say things like, if Israel falls, Western civilization will fall with it. And I simply said, Zionist threats, # Samson option. That's how I read that. And I worry that is kind of the growing mindset that, we're going to bring you all down with us. And I just kind of worry about that going that direction. And clearly we all see the kind of continuation of this violence, So I hope it does go in a way that, however that ends up, where it's somehow drawn back to like a peaceful de-escalation to where there can be self-determination for Palestinians and whatever the Israelis are willing to do, which doesn't involve genocide, that we can lean into that, But I guess any final thoughts on that as we kind of wrap up here?
I think Israel is heading towards national suicide. It's already committed suicide. It's just a matter of time before it falls. That could be in a matter of months with an armed conflict, with an awful, atrocious armed conflict in the Middle East, or it could be over a period of years. What it has done is crossed every single red line. And it's either an indication of what's to come on a more global level, that these sort of things will be accepted more, or this will be that end of such horrors. And it's shocking to people because it's not in the 50s or 60s or 40s or before. This is happening right now. And so that's why it's shocked people in this way. And I think in terms of the intensity of the bombing, the amount of buildings blown up, the amount of munitions used, the fact that people are packed in such a densely populated area and so many of them have been slaughtered, it's one of the worst crimes we've ever witnessed in modern history.
I agree.
It might not be, and you might find a whole bunch of different massacres and attacks and genocides that are larger in number, but in its intensity and the way that it is happening and the fact that it's all being filmed in this way and how atrocious it all is, I think it's one of the worst things that we've ever seen. I don't think anyone else has even has experienced anything like this. Exactly. It's a very unique attack in the way that it's structured and the way the Israelis are carrying on. And it's not to say horrible events haven't happened in the past. They weren't recorded in this way. We don't have that footage. We don't get the day-to-day, minute-to-minute updates of what is being done.
And the psychological aspect, moving them from place to place, laughing about it, filming it, I think that adds such a dark level to it that I've never seen before.
It's like some post-apocalyptic sci-fi movie where aliens are subjecting people to weird forms of torment and torture and mass murder. It doesn't seem like it's possible to be done by a group of humans to another group of humans, but this is the process of dehumanization. And Israel has, the fact that everyone now publicly, before, look, if anyone compared them to Nazis, then the anti-Semite label would come out and you wouldn't be listened to. But the fact that so many people are comparing them to Nazis now tells you everything you need to know. It tells you everything you need to know about how they are operating, what that society has degenerated into in terms of the way that it looks at Palestinians, and what it's able to do and support en masse. You're talking about the majority of them support the war crimes. The majority of them don't think enough force has been used or think enough force has been used. So they don't say too much has been used. That's like in the single digits in all the polls. Right. They might not like Netanyahu, but they support the war. So Israel is heading down a very dark route, and I believe it will be destroyed. Whether that happens over time and it's a more peaceful transition, or whether that happens very quickly and violently, very hard to predict. I don't like to put time frames on things because then I'll often be wrong when I try and put a time on something. But I don't see a way out for the Israelis. I don't think they can return to normality. Every single aspect that you look at, it's been defeated. And there's no way that it can recover properly. That society won't recover. Its army won't recover. Its economy, everything, like the psychology won't, to repair from this. I don't think they can do it. And the Palestinians aren't going anywhere. You have to exterminate every single Palestinian on this planet if you think that you are going to, I mean, going around the world and exterminating Palestinians in every corner of the globe. Because as long as there's Palestinians, there'll be resistance. And they'll never stop because they're fighting for their homelands and their human rights. And, mass murdering people and torturing them is not going to stop them from resisting. It's going to make the resolve stronger. And that's what we're seeing. Their resolve is much stronger. It continues to be strong. And they're very committed. And also they have very strong religious convictions as well. Many of the people, they believe that this land, right, and the fight for this land is something like you're going to become a martyr for this, as a Muslim or a Christian Palestinian believer, you believe that this is a sacred battle between good and evil, that you are fighting for your rights. You are doing what Jesus preached for you to do, to retain your human rights, for your dignity, to pursue peace ultimately in the Holy Land, and also to fight when your injustice is done against you. And that's what people there think, and that's what they feel, and they're never going to stop because they want their human rights. So the Israelis, they've miscalculated, and being racist, psychopathic killers, and transforming your society into a society which accepts that is not going to win you any victory. Only living in peace, only granting equal rights will be the only way that Israel will continue to exist and maybe even have that name. But otherwise, there won't be an Israel because they can't continue doing this and committing these horrors.
Yeah. And hopefully that's a principle on which we can build for the world, right? And actually not just pretend to fight for human rights, but actually believe in that, and that's my kind of knock to the governments that pretend that they fight for these things while supporting this. But, I sure hope that this ends in a way that, it minimizes or stops the death and suffering. But I think you're right. Sadly, I think this is going to be pushed to the extreme. But, thank you for taking the time to break all this down for people, because it's difficult. Those people, people that are watching this and reporting on this as much as you are, it is as you well know, it's something that sits with you, just from what I've seen, this is never going to leave me, And so for the people out there that just don't have can't stomach it, it's important for them to be able to hear what you're saying and understand this and at least possibly see a way out. And so, just thanks, man. I appreciate all the objective effort you put into this, which again, I've said every time, I don't know how hard that must be for you. And so just the respect. So thank you for being here and breaking this all down. Is there anything else you want to leave us with on the way out?
No, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure, and thank you for everything you do as well. We can hope that things do get better, but I think we're heading towards escalation. And unfortunately, you don't want to leave it on a negative note. Unfortunately, there will be a lot more suffering. But I believe fundamentally that at the end of this suffering, that it will have meant something, and people will be able to live in peace. And this evil will be defeated, and humanity will move on. Assuming there's not nuclear war.
No, I was just going to say, I think that. But to end on that positive note, I completely agree. And I think, it's always hard for people to see this, especially when you're in the midst of the worst things we're seeing. But, that this is a reaction of good against evil, right? The reason this has become so apparent and so much, it's because it's like the argument from the beginning, like the Palestinian resistance did this, as much as this is used as a way to attack them, like you knew Israel would respond, but what a dumb thing to say. So we knew they'd commit genocide, so you shouldn't have done it, But the point is they knew that this would likely, maybe not to this extent, but that Israel would punish them, that they would hurt civilians because of what happened. But it was done for at least hoping that it might just cause this reaction, that maybe people would finally go, oh my God, I see it. And that's happened, right? If out of all of this, that is definitely a positive outcome, that people have finally seen what the Zionist entity, what Israel is doing, and that is a positive turn, and that hopefully this can snowball. Even if it's just reactions of governments that, just don't want you to know they're bad, and so they start at least acting better in the world. Even that will have positive reverberations, and I think that you're right. I think this, however this gets through, maybe it gets worse before it gets better. I do believe that this is a positive change happening in the world. And we as individuals, and whether you're reporters or just commentators, whatever you're doing, it's important to make sure that we don't let that go, that we follow through with this and that we make it better, whether in small actions in your world or continuing to highlight the fact that there is positive change happening and that we should demand better of the people that pretend to represent us. So thank you for being here, Robert. I really do appreciate all that you're doing, and more work will be coming out for TLAV. So make sure you check it out from Robert and everybody else. And as always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Question of taking sides. It's a question of being concerned with the fate of humanity. Palestine right now is a focal point. It's a focus for all that is troubling and threatening humanity. There were studies of Palestinian kids done over 20 years ago now that showed them amongst the most traumatized people in the world, with mental health issues and behavioral problems and physical problems and post-traumatic symptoms. What can we imagine is going to be the impact when so many of them are traumatized now, orphaned right now, physically hurt right now, under the present conditions of the siege mentality inside Israel. Until we have conditions of peace, we can't even conceive of what healing might look like. But if people are no longer under threat and no longer perceive themselves under threat, and that means ending the occupation, ending the apartheid, ending the racism, we can't even talk about healing.
If you believe, as Zionist propaganda would have it, and tries to drill into the heads of young Jewish North Americans like I was, that to be Jewish is to be identified with this modern, highly militarized, nationalistic, and racist apartheid state, then of course any criticism of that state by the transitive principle will mean that you're attacking all Jews. But then if you don't accept that premise, then you're going to forcefully reject the notion that to criticize it is to malign the Jewish people. And the notion that if someone objects to starving an entire population, murdering tens to hundreds of thousands of people, if anyone objects to that, hates me, well, that's actually an anti-Semitic principle. And I I reject it. Israel is a distortion at best of what Jewishness and Judaism are supposed to be. It's a complete misdirection, and I see it as the number one threat to the safety and physical and mental and emotional and spiritual well-being of Jews everywhere.